Let's get started. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. It's great to have everyone here. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for joining. We are so excited to have all of you join in. Participants are joining. Again, if you'd like to share the Zoom registration link, feel free to do so. People can still join, and we also are live on Facebook as well. If you have any questions for Rupy and Sunmit, please send them through the Q&A function. You can find that both on your phone and on the screen if you're on computer at the bottom of the screen. And you can just type in your questions and we'll get them in. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. But I promise you, based on the number of people attending, I probably won't be able to ask Rupy and Sunmit all of them, but we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. And with that, Rupy, Sunmit, thank you so much for joining us for Summer Series. As we shared with both of you before, Summer Series has just been this incredible opportunity that we've been able to make out of the pandemic, and as unfortunate as it is, though it is for our safety to have to stay home and not really be able to meet with our Sanghats, it has created this opportunity to create virtual spaces for more of us to meet and take time from usually what are very, very busy schedules and not have to travel to be able to have these conversations. So again, thank you both for joining us today. And I'm going to start off with really quick bios, but then I will ask both of you to share a little bit more about your journey that goes way beyond the bios. So Rupy, starting with you. Rupy is based out of Oakland. She's on the West Coast, so is getting a lot of nice sun today, hopefully.
Although I'm in a basement, so.
Doesn't look like it. So she's a visual artist that's working to bring together two unique traditional art forms, both Indian miniature painting, specifically 18th century Indian art form, and calligraphy. And her work is incredible. It's one of the first pieces I've ever personally bought. Her work is particularly remarkable because she takes a lot of care to understand traditional materials, understand history, and like bring that into her contemporary work and her current work. And she really thinks about historical and contemporary narratives. She's also like a beautiful speaker. I've always been in awe every time she's presented. Her Punjabi, Urdu, her understanding of poetry and rich Punjabi history is just impeccable. And I've just really personally enjoyed learning so much from you, Rupy, over the years. So excited to have you here. And Sunmit is also, like Rupy, a dear friend, and is a Sikh art collector, an antique dealer, and founder of Hazur Art. He is currently involved with and making sure that everyone understands the importance of the trade of Sikh art within the community and understanding where Sikh antiques and whose hands they really lie in. He founded Hazur Art in 2017, and through Hazur Art, he's also looking at formalizing the Sikh American Archive to collect both digital and physical history of Sikh American history, preserve contemporary artwork as well, highlight contemporary Sikh artists through Hazur Art. And he is a graphic designer and printer by profession, founder of Inkspill. And again, he's just an enthusiast. And if you grab him for 5 minutes or an hour, he can give you quite a bit of history that you may or may not want to hear. But again, I will say this about both Rupy and Sunmit. You have taken your passions for Sikh and Punjabi history and really taken them to the next level to understand the depth and the importance of what it means to preserve and continue Sikh art and history. So with that, I really want to just talk a little bit about what we hope to have through this conversation. We want to talk about the preservation of the past, why it's so critical. Through this conversation, we also want to encourage present day Sikh artists to think seriously about their work and what that means for themselves, and through that catalyze our futures, right? It's really about how do we build our power as a Panth, and art is a very, very, very powerful form of power. And it's something that we've always had as a community, And in current times, it sometimes feels like it's lost, but it doesn't have to be, and it really isn't. It's just buried a little bit. And I hope through this conversation, we can start exposing some of that. So let's get started. Rupy, last week, you raised a question on Instagram stories, and you asked about the distinction between antique art and contemporary art. What do you think the difference is, and how do you categorize your art specifically?
That's a great question. And also it's because I was curious about this question is why I posed it. I think for me, the distinction is definitely also time, like how long ago was a piece of art made, then it's definitely categorized as antique. I think if you look at just the copyright laws, I think it's 150 years ago if something was made, it has more of a free use label on it so people can access and use it. So for me, everything that is at least 100 years ago is what I would say antique art, but you know, it's a blurred line. And I think Sunmit would definitely clarify that. But antique art is definitely, I think, art for me because from a miniature painter perspective is art that doesn't always have an individual artist label on it. Also, just because miniatures don't tend to have individual artist names on it. Compare that to contemporary art, it always has a name attached to it, who's made it, who's commissioned it. And I think it just gives you a lot more description and a lot more information because it's made in contemporary times and it's more current. Also, I think with this question, when I asked this on Instagram, the second question I asked was, well, which art would you want to see more of? And which art would you want to, it was a poll I did, and I was really curious. And this was a trick question where I was like, well, which art do you think relates to your life more or your lived experience? And I think the answers were what I was predicting was that most people want to see more of antique art or antique Sikh art because somewhere there is a huge amount of pride and a huge amount of information that we extract from these older pieces of art. And it doesn't have to be just paintings. It includes so many different categories. However, contemporary Sikh art is what we identify with more because most of these artists are living among us or have lived among us and have depicted scenes and scenarios in our lives that we feel, okay, this is what I've seen also, and this is what I can relate to, but then somewhere that's less valuable to us because it's a lived experience. So those are some distinctions between these two categories. And I think in general, just the way art is manufactured or made or produced now is very different from when art was made, 100 years ago. So that's definitely one of the main differences. Artists now have very different challenges than they did that many years ago. So these are two distinctions for me. My art definitely lies in the contemporary Sikh art category because I'm a contemporary living artist, painting not only historically rooted stories, but also trying to paint it from the perspective of someone who's alive today, right? Perspective of someone who is living in society today and engaging with what's happening in the world today. So, but I also think that because I was like, I need to complicate my job a little bit. So everything I do create has to have some sort of a historical root in it. So whether it's a miniature painting, and if I'm trying a technique that hasn't been done before by me, then I know it has to have some sort of historical root in terms of technique. Okay, technically, this piece is rooted historically in this technique done this many years ago by this type of style or school. Or if it's a historical reference in terms of events, I try to make sure that there's always history inspiring that piece. And which also means I do a lot of research. So I blur the boundaries in terms of what's more important to me. But on that same note, there's definitely something I'm proud of, which is that I do fit in the Sikh contemporary art category, because I would hope that there's some weight in this category that I can add to that eventually changes the way this, art power in our community is looked at many years from now.
Yeah, and I think, Rupy, one of the things you and I have discussed quite a bit is you've really taken that additional step to make sure that you are incredibly serious and invested in your art and your art journey. And it is your career, it is your path. And I think it's very inspirational to see how you're carving that lane for yourself as a Sikh woman as well. And so, yeah, I again, always in awe. And so Sunmit, building off of a little bit of what Rupy said, right? So she's really, and I think the interesting thing that she brought up is people are really interested in antique Sikh art. And as much as I believe that, in the sense of like we want to look to our art and history and we're so proud of our history as a people, I don't always feel that we value our antiques, our art. I don't feel like we've really created homes for it appropriately. And I know we'll get a little bit into that. So can you talk a little bit about how you define Sikh antiques and antique art, what you think their current state actually is, since Rupy already brought that up, and how do you define your role as a Sikh collector and why you got into it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. For me, I think Sikh antiques is, I keep it simple. Anything over 100 years old falls into the category of antique, be it coins, paintings, jewelry, manuscripts. Anything older than 100 years old falls in the legal antique category. But deeper than that is, for me, art is about stories, whether it's contemporary art or antique art. Um, what Rupy is painting today is sort of the mindset of her surrounding as a Sikh in the diaspora. In about 150 years, the Sikhs from the future will be looking at that as an antique art and saying this was Rupy Kaur from 2020, and the Sikhs of that time were thinking about this and talking about this and painting about this. So for me, when I collect stuff from the 19th century and the 18th century, those are stories. You know, if Sikhs were painting or creating something or wearing something or fighting with something, that tells the story of our journey through the past 500 years. So for me, it's really storytelling, be it contemporary or antique. What is the state of our antiquities today? Unfortunately, and I don't blame our community for this, you have to look at it in historical context. The Sikhs have been dealing with genocides, displacement, looting since day one. And so when you're in a situation like that, you kind of grab whatever, be it family members or your closest belongings, and you're on the move and on the run. Whether that's from the Guru period or the annexation or 1984, we've always been under that pressure. So our art also has been displaced along with us as a people. So I don't blame our community that, oh, we haven't really done a good job of keeping our antiquities alive. But I think today, as we stand in the last 50 years, in the diaspora, we've been in a better position to kind of collect the pieces of the puzzle of the past and put them together and then kind of create that story of the last 300, 400 years of what were we doing that many years ago. And it's sort of an ongoing thing. It's not going to be my generation or our generation that's going to solve this thing. But I think we're in a good place in the diaspora and even in Punjab to kind of start collecting, start discussing and researching things of the past while we sort of facilitate the contemporary art world. So if we don't make anything today, 150 years from now, they're going to look back and what did these guys do? They didn't make anything. They were busy collecting, which is also fair, but I think we've got to, it's sort of the two sides of the same coin. We got to focus on both. We got to revive those art traditions. We can't just be looking at martial arts from an antique lens. We have to be practicing those. We got to keep making those swords and not just collecting them, and be it paintings or embroidery or whatever the art form is. I think I missed your last question. I can't remember.
No, it's just, how did you embark on this journey?
So when I was young, I think I was collecting coins, and I still have those 2 coin books from like when I was 8 or 9. And then when we moved to the US in 2000, I was not in a position to collect anything. It was more of a survival, you know, trying to just get by financially and family wise. And then I made a trip to Punjab in 2007 and got really excited when we went to Anandpur Sahib. Somebody tried to sell us some kirpans, and they were like, these are antique. They're like from Guru Sahib's periods. And I was head over heels. I was like, take my money, whatever you want. I have to take these back to show everybody. When I got back, couple of months later, I had a Sikh art collector from the UK who was visiting the US look at them, and he was like, unfortunately, these are reproductions. They've just been made, and I'm sorry that you had to go through this. But that got me going, and I was like, how do I learn more? How can I identify what's antique and what's not, what's being reproduced and what's sort of actually antique? And that journey is like, what, 12 years now? And, you know, you could still get fooled. I still consult my mentors that, is this really authentic, or is this somebody trying to just pass off as authentic? So that got me all sorts of ways into this world of Sikh art and antiques. That one experience, I think.
Those are also the usual conversations Sunmit and I are having over text message. Is this painting or miniature painting that's from way back, or is it new?
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, let's discuss this.
Yep.
And this is why it's actually really important to build a network of Sikh artists, contemporary, and those that are collecting, right? Because there's a lot to learn from one another, and a lot of shared knowledge that we need to think through. And I think, Sunmit, the other point that you made that is really critical is we need to revive some of our methods. Yeah, like the traditions that we actually have, the methods. And, you know, I know personally, right? Like growing up, you're like, oh, it's no big deal. Like, this is like, you know, purane zamane da kaam, we don't need to actually do it and things like that. And like at this age, I'm like, oh man, I really wish I had learned that embroidery style, or I wish I had learned how to do X or Y. And I think as we're, you know, I know there's a couple of people that I can recognize already and thinking about what's next for Khalsa schools, right? So like there's Gurmat studies, but like as we start building schools and centers for the Sikh community, like how are we incorporating some of these other ideas and these other traditions into that? It's really interesting, right? Someone was in our inbox today talking about how important STEM, science, technology, math, and all of education is, and it absolutely is, and we can incorporate that into our centers. But how do we also incorporate these old traditions that are really going to carry us forward in many ways? So I just wanted to amplify that point that you made.
Just to add to that before I forget, because I got a memory of a pea brain. Just last week, I was talking about this, and I said that one of my biggest fears is that, you know, whatever we know as Sikh tradition or Sikh art, as we sort of collect it and we make museums, my fear is that in 100 years, we don't lose the actual art making process, whether it is Shastra Vidya, whether it's calligraphy, painting, embroidery. You know, the future generations shouldn't have to just go to a museum to see what was of the past, but also have a continuation of those art forms, so that way of life for us, the storytelling has always been a way of life. And I think we need to make sure that we continue that and not just kind of just go into putting all of this in a museum and don't put all our eggs in that one basket.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rupy, actually, that's like an incredible segue. You have an incredible resume. You have studied in-depth miniature paintings, calligraphy, history. You've spent a year cataloging over 400 pieces, I believe it was, for the Kapani Collection of Fine Arts, the Sikh Foundation. So through that journey, you have really spent a lot of time understanding that history, understanding those traditions. What are some interesting moments that you've learned from, pieces of history that you have applied to your work?
Yeah, I think I have to give context to that too, because it feels like from what you're saying that journey or that learning is complete, but I would just say I've only just, you know, been able to learn the tip of the iceberg so far. One thing that I always suggest to people who are artists or budding artists is that this career, especially if you're interested in Sikh art, which involves a lot of learning of Sikh history, a lot of learning of, you know, any objects that are related to Sikh art history, also learning of art history in general, the world art history, and then learning from and learning of other painters or painting traditions that are connected to all of these objects that you might be working with. And all this, of course, I've learned through all these experiences, such as cataloging the work before. And that started sort of with the idea that I had this hunger to look at miniature paintings. unfortunately, the museums that were around or the collections that are around were not so accessible for me. I was just starting, just starting out, and all I knew was that I had a curiosity and a hunger to just look at miniature paintings, because that's the one thing that you have to do with any of these traditional art forms or any of these antiques. You just have to stare at them for many hours.
Yeah.
And you just have to hope that, there's a hand, and there's a hand memory forming, as well as a memory forming of what these things look like and how they behave. So when the Sikh Foundation agreed to let me be an artist in residence for a year, I was really excited, because I had not been able to hold a miniature painting in my hand. So I think this is one thing that I would love to touch on later when we talk about, what do we need to do to change some of the things we're not doing so far, is access, right? So when I did access all those pieces that are in the Kapani collection, which, he was wonderful to let me look at, and also to catalog, and also to go through. And if somebody doesn't know what cataloging means, it's basically, you take any piece of art, which is an antique piece of art. In his collection, most of the pieces were antique pieces of art, and you look at the collection, you look at the piece, you try to first form your understanding of what it looks like what is the physical description of it. You try to find the year for it. You try to find, where has it been before? Has it been, anywhere else in the world before? You try to figure out what the value is not that important actually as a cataloger, but you do try to figure out where it might have been made, and who was it made for, and who was it made by. So this is what a cataloger does. And some people might be like, well, you're a painter. Why did you catalog for a year? What a waste of time. But actually that was very important, because as a painter, it's very important for me to know how are paintings labeled, how are art objects labeled. And if I was to say that, the top lessons I've learned from that experience, and also from the experience of just learning so far what I have learned about miniature painting, is the first thing is just like a really sad note, which is that a lot of the knowledge that I would love to have is just missing. It's just not there. There's many people you will get bits and pieces from, and then you just kind of have to construct a treasure map of where you're going to find just the holy grail of that knowledge. The second thing that was really important was that I noticed was a lot of these older paintings, for example, there were these albums that were commissioned by European tourists in Punjab in the late 1800s. And, a lot of them had inscriptions or writings of what are they describing, and usually these painting albums had, pieces or paintings of the rulers at the time. So from Satjeet Singh to his son, to Rani Jinda, and then a few important members of the court, as well as, the daily occupations, blah, blah, blah. But the way that, the person who had probably gotten their hands on this album, the way that they describe some of what is going on in the painting was really striking to me, because, for example, there's something really stood out to me where in one painting of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the word used to describe him was, I think, freebooter was a word, or it was a word it was a very derogatory word. And, as a very new student of Sikh history, I was just like, what does that mean? And why is he being described this way? So what I learned from that experience is that the way our history has been written is very important to look at, because who has written that history is very important. Who has been the one who's formed that value judgment? And in this sense, when I say history, I'm saying art history. Art history is a very important set of value judgments being made by many people who usually don't belong to the culture. So for me, it became a very important skill set to have, as I was creating my work, to be able to write about it, so that later when somebody's describing my work, they know that this is the words of the artist. So in the art world, having the language skills is very, very important. And this is how I've implemented that small experience, right? And just knowing that, yes, Maharaja Ranjit Singh was looked at from very different perspectives as a different person, depending on who was describing him. But one thing that was very important to me was that it was very important for me to dig into that, and to have the curiosity to dig into that and find my own answer. And of course, there's many historians now who have done so much work. And I think that's one of the main findings. The second is, of course, it's very important to have painters who are depicting us. It's amazing when collectors have collected, and of course, there are beautiful paintings of different parts of Punjab and different parts of the Sikh Empire done by European painters, because somewhere they're also documentation of our history. But it's very, very important today, when we do have some sort of power to make these decisions, to have painters depicting our own community, our own painters. And it might sound like, okay, well, what if somebody else is doing it and doing a great job? And yes, that's great, that's amazing. But I still want to have that for cross-reference, like 100 years from today, like you both are saying, that this is what the painters are seeing today. So when I'm working on a painting of Darbar Sahib, I want to be able to see it from a perspective of someone who looks like me, who might have had a childhood like me, who might have had a grandmother like mine. That's very important to me, because somewhere that acknowledges my life as a Sikh and acknowledges my existence. So I think in this way, it was very important for me to take my job very seriously as a painter. I mean, I think like this. I don't think all painters need to think like this, but I wish they did. But I think this is where I get kind of gung-ho about what I do, because like the other day I was calling Sunmit. I was like, Sunmit, I need you to describe what this person would look like, because he would be that person, So it's very important to put in the time to do research. And I think this is also coming from one other point that I've learned so far from researching, is that you need to have mentors, both mentors who are painters and also mentors who are just historians, just citizen historians or art historians. Whether they're Sikh or not is totally fine, but you need to have mentors, because they are the ones who will keep asking you the hard questions also. When you get full of yourself and you think you know everything, they will tell you like, well, hey, there's another angle to look at. And all these three pieces of advice is just something I would give anybody, but this is what I function on mainly. So far these are the things I've learned, and I'm sure there's many others, but I can't remember.
No, Rupy, like your point about representation. So representation in the actual art form, like who's getting represented. Is that diverse? Is it representative of the culture of the community? Who is depicting and who is creating? So even if you're going to the Darbar Sahib example, what someone who believes in the Guru Granth Sahib Ji or understands the importance of Akal Takht or the Darbar Sahib or the Nishan Sahib, right? From a spiritual place, from a historical place, that depiction is going to be very different than someone's who's coming to look at it from a, like, this is beautiful, or this structure is beautiful, or
impressive. It could just be a cool building, right?
Yeah, the imagery is beautiful. And it's not to dismiss the latter, but there's something very important and essential about the former that we really have to be able to unpack, and which is why it's so important to encourage Sikh artists, encourage individuals who are Sikh, who have that type of history, have that type of background, to get into the arts and really again, invest in themselves, right? Like, in our community should be investing in them as well. And I think the second point that you made, it's not just representation, but it's who's at the decision-making table when it comes to arts. And like, we've had a lot of conversations this week when it comes to summer series about race and exclusionary practices. And Sunmit, you touched upon this in the beginning, right? Like, context matters. And we can say that like, oh, we haven't done a great job of preserving our art, but why? It's been taken from us, right? Or other people have had the decision-making authority because maybe they have expertise, quote unquote, or are identified as having expertise, but why isn't it that we're investing in our own to build that expertise? Why isn't it that we're encouraging our own to be sitting in those positions, that they are curating at museums, or they are deciding how things are written, they are exploring art history and gaining that expertise so they can sit at that table. So
or that they are the ones painting also.
Yeah. And so I think I just, again, wanted to underscore those really, really critical points. Sunmit, like, just building off of that, right? How do you, as someone that's collecting and someone that's like literally, I don't want to sound like this is all you do, because I know it's not, but right, like, you're looking at like bids going and like you're watching whose hands things are going into. Like, this conversation about representation and decision making and who has power, like, how does that all sit in when you're watching those bids?
Uh, I may not physically be doing this all the time, but mentally, this is all I'm doing. So I don't know how things work for me, but in the past, I think 4 or 5 years, it's just been snowballing. Like it's just becoming all I think about and all I do. Uh, and how I think keeping track of things for me, at least within the US, has been very important because I have sort of a better network within the US than I have worldwide. And there's been a little rise in the past 50 years. I use 50 years because that's when Dr. Kapani started collecting in the US. But he inspired a lot of folks to start collecting that were his sort of Hanade, his generation of people, whether it was not seriously collecting, but they still engaged in collecting. So for me, it's important to keep track of these things because I believe in the future we will have our curators, we will have our conservators, we will have our museums, and that's when whatever is in our hands collectively as a bunt, as a community, I think we'll be able to display there, whether it's on the East Coast, West Coast, or on all the coasts. Sharing among museums is quite common. Loaning artifacts from collections and museums is sort of very normal. And I think a lot of the serious Sikh collectors that I've spoken to in my network are always willing to lend their objects and their collections for exhibitions, for research. So that's why keeping track of this is very important for me, because I don't know when an opportunity might come up where somebody's putting together an exhibition and they need a particular object. And my little database in my head is like, oh, I know who has this. Let me connect you to, and we can make your exhibition or your thing even better. So that's sort of where that comes into play. It's a lot of work, but I think I don't look at it as work anymore because it's just what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, and I think Sunmit, building off of that, right? You've traveled quite a bit around the world, and particularly in India and Punjab. What are a couple of interesting finds that you've facts, artifacts that you've found or learned along the way? Is there a piece that you wish you could have secured but haven't been able to, or you feel like it's not going to be easily accessible to the community?
Yeah, so traveling has just, since that 2007 trip, I've been a regular visitor to Punjab. And I think a recommendation that I would give everybody that goes back to Punjab is, I know from personal experience that when we go back to, whether it's Delhi, Punjab, or wherever you live in India, you have a limited schedule when you go from the diaspora, and it's like weddings, shopping, relatives, do, and you're like, okay, time to go back, and 2 weeks or 3 weeks went by really fast. I'd always like to give myself a few exploration days where I don't do any of those to do things, and it's just kind of like go to a place that you haven't been before. Or if you're like me, in the early days starting from 2007, I used to spend a week and a half at Darbar Sahib just exploring. I'd go to random places in that complex and find new things I had never seen before. And then I ended up doing workshops about the places that I found and called them secret Darbar Sahib places. And I would do workshops at the Gurmat camps here locally, because when I went with my parents, it would be like matha tek, eat langar, take prasad, and let's go shopping. That was all Darbar Sahib was to me. But when I was there alone, oh my God, there is a wealth of things there to see. It's just a genius complex that I still haven't explored every corner of it. I'll be honest, I still don't know everything about it. But there is so much to explore in that one complex. And then you grow out of it to the surrounding areas, the buildings, the gates in Amritsar. It's just amazing how much there is. So that's the travel part of it. And the second thing that I just started doing is I think there's a lot of antiquities within our families. And including myself, we ignore those. Whether it's medals from your grandfather or great-grandfather, be it fulkaris from your grandmother, great-grandmother, letters. It could be anything, photographs from even the 80s of your parents immigrating from India to America, or even in the 60s. So all of this is history, and all of this is antique, and all of this needs to be preserved. And if it's in your family, that's the easiest thing you can start with, is start taking care of them. But be mindful of displacement. I'll give you an example if we have time. Is my wife Amrit's Nana ji was in the military, and so his medal was at one of his daughter's homes. And 2 years ago, they just pulled it out of a closet on like a string, and they're like, "Oh, look, this is Nanaji's medal." And I was like, "Wow!" Like, I was just fascinated. It's a General Service Medal of the British Indian Army, but I was just also sad that it's like hanging on a string and in a closet. Now, my first like privileged diaspora instinct would say, grab it, take it back to America because we take care of it better. These people in India don't know how to take care of stuff. I slept on it for like a whole 6 months, 7 months. And then this year, when I went back in February, I purchased a ribbon that belonged with that medal from France. And then I got my younger cousin for a day, and I took her on a tour of Darbar Sahib, the Partition Museum, Jallianwala Bagh. And I kind of got her like into this world. And I was like, look at all these things that people have preserved of their past. When we got home, and I was like, let's work on this medal. We cleaned it up. We attached the ribbon. We sewed it on. We went and bought a frame together. And she was just so proud of her Nannu's medal now. She was like, this is my Nannu's medal, and it's in the frame, and we're going to put it in the showcase. So that displacement of that object didn't happen. It stayed within the family, and it was preserved so that there was no further deterioration. I think that was something that everybody can start doing.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think going a little bit deeper, it should be a responsibility that we're encouraging to place on one another, of how do we go into our own homes and start thinking about that. Like, as you were talking, I'm thinking about like what my sister and I can do, because we have so much stuff in our basement.
You gotta realize, by the time your kids get older, this is all gonna be antique, and this is all gonna be old. And if you're like me, you're gonna tell your kids are gonna tell you, "Mom, tusi saam ke kyun nahi rakhya kuch bhi?"
Yeah.
And it's not mom's fault. Mom's mom my nanny went from Pakistan to Banaras, and from there to the US. So like, they had to make sacrifices of what they can take with them. So whatever has survived, it's our responsibility to keep it intact for future generations to come.
Yeah.
I can add a resource here, actually. There's many resources I had to use when I was cataloging Dr. Kapani's collection, because I had to learn to also store it correctly so that it would be preserved and it wouldn't get damaged. And most of it was preserved, but I just had to learn, and I wanted to learn. So there is a small museum's catalog online on preservation that anybody can just access a PDF of. And it just shows you how to preserve everything from textile to paper to paintings. But it gets a little bit expensive sometimes, but I still think that anybody who's ever asked me advice on preserving or just taking care of their family heirlooms, that's one PDF that I would just send them, because anybody can read it and do it, especially if it's within their family.
Rupy, if you can actually share that with me, we'll put in the resources that we share after with all of the people that registered. So I'm going to pause my questions and really getting into, I think, a bit about like opportunities, what we should do next. There's a couple of just really interesting questions for both of you that are going to be pretty quick. So Rupy, do you recognize more with one school of miniature forms of Sikh art? Hopefully I don't butcher the names, Guler, Kangra, Chamba.
That's a great question. And that's a question I've been asking myself. So for the entire audience, these are all the sub-schools of Pahari School of Painting, which is Pahari School of Painting is what I identify with. And it just happened to be that the teacher I learned from is a does the Pahari School. So that's what I ended up learning. For me, so based on what recently I have seen, right? So this is where I would say is also a disclaimer, is that I don't get to see everything, firstly, of what historically has been painted with Sikh characters in it. I don't get to see everything. But the parts I have seen, I'm always looking for references of Guler style, where Sikh characters occur in the Guler style. I was really happy recently. I think it was in the Tur collection that I have seen recently more paintings of Sikhs and Sikh gurus done in the Gulair style, which made me really happy, because what that does is it gives me a marker historically where the paintings sat on how Sikh Bana, how Sikh characters, how Sikh life was portrayed. I've seen it less in Kangra style. I'm not surprised, because Kangra style has always been associated with court life, and it was more focused on what was happening in the court and more the women of the court. I'm sure there were some paintings that were done, but Gulair style more, because I think Gulair style had a very specific purpose for most kings, which was to commission religious paintings. So I would think that it would, especially the guru paintings, would probably occur in the Gulair style. But again, I have not seen everything, which is why I was like, I would love to have access to all the collections in the world. But it's so great now that the collectors are sharing images of what they own. And, you know, I'm getting to see them online virtually, which is great. But that's an awesome question, by the way.
Yeah, it was
very specific, but made me happy.
It was by Amandeep Singh.
Awesome.
Sunmit, 2 questions for you. One, what is the status of artifacts in Pakistan? And can you recommend places and sites around Darbar Sahib? And that's from Professor Dave and Kamal Singh.
The status of artifacts in Pakistan is actually surprisingly a lot better than India. And the reason is two-part. One is there just hasn't been a lot of activity there. The curators that I spoke to recently they were like, we just have all this stuff from back then and we haven't touched it. And we're also afraid to bring it out for a lot of socio-political reasons, that the government of India may start wanting it back, saying this belongs to us, and just all this riot that might cause. But they're kind of just stored there. Now, the problem with that is they're not being looked after well. So if something is just sitting in a closet for the past 50 years, that can't be really good either for an antique object. So we do need to get conservators and restorers out there to carefully look at a lot of the Sikh objects that are in Pakistan and start that journey. I know that started with architecture. There's a lot of focus on Sikh buildings and architecture in Pakistan, which is amazing. And it's a step-by-step, because this whole world has a lot less resources than other Sikh things do. So whether it's or whatever other stuff that has a lot more resources allocated than
medicine.
Yeah, preservation of art and architecture and artifacts. So
no, and some of them, I'm gonna actually like interrupt for a second. I think that's a really important point. That shouldn't be dismissed. Like, we as a community decide where we're putting resources entirely. And there are a lot of important causes. There's a lot of important issue areas and topics. But if we feel that this is important, then it requires resources. It requires human capital and it requires financial capital. And it requires us putting our expertise behind it as well. So I do want to underscore that, because I think it's a really critical point. And sometimes we all feel like we can just do everything, but like we have to prioritize, and like we have to put our resources in those priority areas. Like Rupy, you just said it. Some of the preservation techniques can get expensive. That doesn't mean we don't do it. That means we prioritize finding the resources to make sure it's done. So,
and if I can be specific there too, I feel like the point you're saying about investment of what we invest in also, because we've been hearing this now, I think for a good 5 years, like we need to invest in the arts more, we need to invest in the arts more, we need to invest in the preservation of our history. One thing that I can say is that there's actually amazing amounts of government grants from different countries in the world where you can get grants. Like, I mean, if I was to apply for Fulbright, say, to go study the paintings in Pakistan and India, I would, I'm speaking, of course, hypothetically, but I would maybe get the grant if I was to write a good application, right? But the thing is that my journey to get to the point where I am qualified enough to get those larger grants is a journey that the community needs to invest in more. Because once the artist or the art historian is qualified enough to be getting these larger grants, that can take up to 10 years. And those 10 years is where the community needs to, think about, well, who are we putting our resources into, and how are we encouraging them to use those resources to a larger picture, to a larger aim, that then benefits the community at large, right? For me, myself, I've been thinking so much more of this recently, where is that, okay, well, you know, I've learned miniature painting, I practice it. This is a lifelong learning experience. I'll have to embark on this journey forever. But, you know, where's the point where you start giving back to the community, where your impact is more than just yourself and just your name and just your art? So I know that many Sikhs, like this is programmed within us, we're questioning ourselves that, well, how do I have a generally larger impact beyond myself? But I think if specifically anybody needs direction, that those are the first 10 years within the arts, whether you're an art historian, whether you're an artist, are the most critical. And those 10 years determine whether later you're going to get the acknowledgement and the funding to then do these larger projects, which involve cross-border learning, cross-border research, which again, that's the other thing for us as Sikh artists is the issue. Because for me, one of the recent exhibitions at the Triton, somebody asked me like, well, how many homelands do you identify with? I mean, there's a lot. I identify with Pakistan, India, and the US as my homeland. Yeah. So when I do research, or when I am telling a story of even just my life, or even the life of my mom or dad, there is a triangulated view from those 3 different homelands. Yeah. So the research needs to be able to be done in all 3 of those homelands, right? Absolutely. And I think to do that research, we need to be able to prepare our artists and our art historians, or anybody in this art field, educators as well, to be able to have the caliber of experience, skill that is comparable to anybody in the world. But that's where I would love to see, community funding, scholarships for students to do trips during their university years, to be able to do this, to get some understanding, form relationships with these institutions that are overseas, and then eventually in their professional life embark on a deeper understanding of learning and investigating a very specific question.
Yeah. Rupy, I'm going to have you hold on that, because I actually want to do a little bit more on access, opportunities, like what's next, and like how do we structure our community around these different ideas and execution. Sunmit, let's go back really quickly. Darbar Sahib, where should people go?
Oh, I think if you're in the complex, just start walking. I mean, there is just so much to see there. I would have to compile a list. I've been wanting to do a blog about it, or like something about it for years. And honestly, it's just a lot of that takes a lot of resources and time to sit down. And for me, my time is divided in, okay, I have to do work so I can, pay myself. But then something popped up online that has to do with Sikh American history that I have to buy, or it's just going to get lost in translation again or whatever. And so it's just like a hamster wheel. I'm always running, and I haven't been able to find the time to share a lot of this yet because of a lack of financial resources. If I can sit here and get paid to just do this work, I would love it, because that's where the archiving comes in. And like Rupy said, I don't want to dodge that Darbar Sahib question. I can compile a list, but off the top of my head, there's a lot there within the complex and the broader.
What are the first 3 that come to your mind?
Yeah. Top 3, give us some.
Okay, so if you go to the Langar Hall, and if you're facing the Langar Hall, there's a wall next to the Langar Hall, and there's a gully that's literally like the size of me, that's between the Langar Hall and the building. You pass that, you come into this really beautiful, like 19th century or probably even late 18th century courtyard, where which you can see from the other side from the Parkarma, and that's where the Sil is, this throne that the Sikhs brought back of one of the Mughal Rajas. Now from there's a little basement door that opens up, and you can go down 3 floors. Yeah, literally opens up like your base, like from the outside. There's 3 floors down there that I've been visiting since like 2008. They were working on it. I think now the construction is complete. This was not under the SGPC, which is why the construction and the preservation has been phenomenal. Like they really, really did a good job of putting this whole thing. And so that's where one of the thrones is of one of the Sikh Rajas that used to sit there. A level below that is a jail where the prisoners were kept. Another level below that is a well that actually connected to Darbar Sahib, and outside the complex that a lot of the Sikhs used even in the 80s. So this is like phenomenal to see that this complex is very complex. It's not what we see from the outside. Another thing is the sundial that is on the bridge that when you walk towards Darbar Sahib after the Dashni Dirty is, there's a sundial to your left, which was used to tell time back in the day because we didn't have clocks. So it's still there, which is amazing. What else is there? Baba Atal Rai. I would definitely visit Baba Atal Rai. That is my favorite spot. A lot of the aerial view photos that you see from the 19th century, there were no drones, there were no helicopters. People would climb up this tallest building in Amritsar to take pictures of the whole complex. And that's still there. Luckily, the first floor still has frescoes all around. The rest of the 7 or 8 floors have been whitewashed and it says, please do not write on this wall. But, you know, those are all local conservation issues that we can talk about for hours. But those 3 things would be amazing if Sikhs from the diaspora went there and actually explored, because they're amazing, they're beautiful, and they survive.
Absolutely.
Can I plug in a question here?
Yeah, you should.
This is just a question to the world. Like I've been seeing some conservation efforts on some of the Meenakari inside the Darbar Sahib. If anybody has more information on it, I would love for them to email me because it just makes my heart stop.
I'll give you the information.
I'm really curious of what they're using and
yeah. I've
just on that note.
I've figured out who's doing it and what they've been doing. I take pictures every year when I go.
Okay, we need to talk.
Pretty obsessed with that area.
See, we could really go on for hours.
Yeah.
But so we're gonna go on for about 20 more minutes. I do want to get now into a little bit about what's the future look like, right? So like the now and the future, and what are some action items we can all take away from this conversation. And I think Sunmit just started us off with one, is to let's make sure that we are taking our own individual responsibility of preserving what is in our homes and what is passed down to us from our ancestors. But let's talk about like, what are the let's use the number 3. What are the 3 things that you each feel that we need to start thinking about more critically, and our ideas or action items that the community should be taking forward?
I think besides what I said, right, like a couple of questions ago about investing in some of the scholars and the learned members of the artist community that we need a lot more of. There's a lot to research. There's no competition. There's a lot to research. So I would love 20 more of me if possible, or even more. But one thing that I think is important to move forward with is a really good network. And it's a network where there's a sharing of knowledge. So, and there are some efforts like, you know, whether it's books being published by different collectors who have the capacity to publish books, which is great because it puts knowledge out in the community. But I think more importantly, it's very important to have, and this is something I think I've seen missing in the miniature world, which is that the artists and the art historians are not talking to each other all the time. So it's just a connection is missing. So for example, if I've seen a painting that Sunmit would share with me and I'm like, well, technique wise, I don't understand why this is painted like this, well as the rest of the painting is painted like this. So what I'm saying is that these conversations that need to be happening between collectors who are also very knowledgeable. You know, you cannot discount their knowledge of what they're researching. Researchers and art historians where also all these people are putting their life's energies into what they're learning. And I really wish we were all able to talk to each other, and that network of knowledge would benefit everybody. I don't know if it would speed up time and speed up our efforts, because as a painter, I can also only paint so much. But I just think that the option of having some sort of and generally I would say I hate conferences, but even if it's like, like these are great, like, what UKPHA has been doing and what you guys are doing in terms of just putting some sort of a format out there that people are engaging in, that people can listen in if they're interested. But that's one thing that would be very great, to have more of a formalized network, even if possible.
Great. Sunmit?
What was that question again? Can you repeat that?
What are a couple of action items that you feel that the community should start thinking about and moving forward that really gets into this idea of preservation of both the antique arts, but also of our contemporary and fostering our contemporary art?
So I was not a contemporary art collector, but I felt like I didn't feel inclined to buy contemporary art, to be honest, because I was spending tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands of dollars buying antique art. So I'm like, I can't do both things. So I think a community effort that came out of that was Hazur art, where I still wanted our community to, I figured out what the problem was. The problem was we were so used to just Sikh art or being given to us, whether it was just at Gurdwara or like we paid like $10 and we got a poster of one of the gurus, and like, or we went to Walmart and just bought flower pictures and we put them on in our homes. That's what the masses were used to, and I don't blame them for that, honestly. It's about educating and sharing. So I think that's where Hazur art came into play, where to me it wasn't about exhibiting Sikh art, and I was like, let's start the trade of Sikh art. Let's get Sikhs into a room with Sikh artists so that trade can happen. Because if artists can sell art, they will be motivated and financially able to create more art. Because it's not a one-way thing that you just get Rupy to keep making and keep making. Who pays her bills? I'll keep taking her art, but like there has to be a trade, right? And so Hazur art was like a in-person platform where, you know, we had really good 3 shows, and this year because of COVID, we're still figuring out what we can do. But maybe the community could invest in efforts like Hazur art and help grow them to make them worldwide, where there's 20 some million Sikhs, you know, and a lot of them live in the diaspora that are actually able to invest in art and antiques. They just don't have the knowledge yet, or sort of that hasn't caught on. In terms of the antiquities, so that was the contemporary side of it. In terms of antiques, I think what the community can do is just, there's 3 steps to collecting, right? The first is collecting, and that requires finances or an interest or passion. The second is the collector actually researches what is it that's very common with me. I'll buy something because it looks sick. I have no idea what it is. I just bought a shield. I have no idea. It arrived yesterday from Sweden. It beats me what it is, but it's sick. It looks sick. So the second part is research. It could take me 2 days or 2 years to research what it is. The third and the critical step is sharing it. And that's where the community comes in, to share the knowledge and the resources to the wider Sikh community. We need resources. I can't just, you know, post about it and be done with it. There has to be more of an effort to create an organization, whether it is the Sikh American Archives that I'm working on, because there's a lot of Sikh American history. We came here over 100 years ago. There was a lot of us here in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and in the 80s was the most post-genocide migration of Sikhs to the US. So there's a lot of history here, and nobody's really cataloging it, collecting it, or curating it. And I've just been interested in it because I live here.
And also keeping it in our own hands, right? Not having the responsibility lie on somebody else to do it.
Absolutely. So I've been like tirelessly collecting that particular genre. And I think I'm at a point where I want to grow this into an organization and sort of open the door so it's just not about me, and that it's about the community and it's about the Sikhs that live in the US to share in that like really awesome history when we step foot in America.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I have my 2 other points that I really want to share.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm thinking a little bit larger picture also, because I think the first thing that because the community has been geared towards survival mode for many years, and we've done a great job of surviving and thriving now. It's and not just in the US, but everywhere. Not everywhere actually, but most places. But what I'm trying to get at is that there needs to be, and you know, I'm not going to say somebody else needs to do it. I mean, even I need to do it, and I do try to do it, is that the idea of why art is important. You know, and this is the question that I've been asking myself, especially also during a pandemic, that why art is still important to us, and why is art important you know, in reference to the world right now, in reference to the community right now, in reference to a family, for example. Like I asked my family this question, like, why is art important to us as a family, regardless of like whether I'm artist or not. So I think this question needs to be posed individually to every single Sikh, firstly, because if you don't realize that art is important to you and why is it important to you, it does not matter what type of cause is in front of you. And, you know, and even if it's a just cause, you might not support it. It has to do with the arts. And the second thing is there needs to be a lot of traffic and cross traffic between art institutions and museums and just the general Sikh public. We need to have our presence felt. Recently, when the Triton did the exhibition, the Guru Nanak exhibition, they had 500 people show up for, you know, the opening night, right? And that's great. And I know our people do show up for food and for drinks and for, you know, that's sort of an informal type of gathering. But why are the, you know, schools not able to bring their kids to have a introduction when there's also a lot of willing artists willing to do artist talks through, you know, what these paintings signify and how they connect to Sikh history and how they connect to Sikh current story or community story. So, and I think there are solutions there, and there are solutions happening in different places, which is why, like, the other element of it, and if you go to this artist, is that access to collections. And if I lived in the UK, I would have access to so many more collections, whether it's the V&A collection, you know, the collections that would educate me and that would really give me a lot more context on what I'm creating. And also collections I can talk about when I reference my work, because that adds weight to how I'm talking about my work, actually. You know, it's just a given, right? So I would say that there's many different small efforts that can be made on the individual level, on the family level. We do make decisions as families in our community. So I think really it's important to focus on families, whether it's, you know, spending time with your kids. And I get a lot of messages where people are saying, well, my kid loves to paint and draw. And I'm like, that's great. That does not mean they're going to become an artist, but that's amazing, because every kid should love to paint and draw or just enjoy it, because we all did. But when it comes to becoming a serious artist, the question I get posed is, well, how do you survive? How much money are you making? I'm like, if you are really serious, you wouldn't be worried about this question right now. It's very important to invest in the arts. The arts are an investment that's a long-term investment. I mean, ask the collectors. That's the vision they start out with.
And I think I'm going to go to a quick question that I think is really important is, you know, and this person just was giving you both a lot of props and Nirvana. So we're so fortunate to have people like Rupy and Sunmit among us. My question to both of you is, what can we do as a community to create a Sikh school of art to inspire and groom more artists and help them? And I think this goes hand in hand with another question that was raised about, like, what more can we be doing as far as like next generation? So like if you were to think about a program, whether it's at Khalsa school or like integrating it into Gurdwara programming, integrating it into youth organizing activities, like how would you structure some of that?
So I think it's interesting that we're getting asked this question, and I think I'll speak for Rupy. I don't know if this makes sense. So Rupy's an artist. I'm a collector, researcher, historian. Those are sort of our passions and our skills. I know for a fact in our community, there are community organizers, people that run organizations, people that are great at project management. So this is where those people come in. Our expertise, or at least mine, I know for a fact that doesn't lie in starting organizations, doesn't lie in running them to a scale where they're $3 million a year organizations, right? My passion is very specific. So I kind of feel like that's where we need to build a team with people with different skill sets. If there's a Sikh school of art that needs to be started, the artists are there and they're good at what they do, but you can't expect them to be administrators of that school, at least not when it's starting out. That's where people that are good at what they do kind of come in. And I think those are the pieces of the puzzle we're struggling with. It's like that Punjabi saying, Jada kunda khole, or whatever that is. Like, if it's your idea, you got to do it kind of thing. I think it's a little, Jada bole kunda khole, right? Like, it's a bit unfair to what you're passionate about. But I mean, that's just my opinion on it.
But I think maybe because I've adopted a dying art form into my practice. I would love to have, there's a vision in my mind of not a school that I don't know if I would run a school, but you know, and also I question formal education in general, but I think if there is thoughts in the community, if there are thoughts circulating through the minds of those who are the stakeholders on that table, whether it's the ones who would be teaching, whether it's the ones who are funding, the ones who are sending their kids there, and then the ones who are, you know, adding accreditation to this entire effort. I think it's a great idea. I think the model school for me in my mind would be where different traditional arts related to the Sikhs are taught. It's not just painting, but for me, I think there are different models in this world of different schools who do that. And it's not like we would be the first to do that.
Right.
I also think that, you know, sometimes even, for example, right now in a pandemic, it's a great time to experiment that, you know, for someone who's really able to stand behind this idea as like, this is my sole passion at the moment. And not someone, I think many someones would be needed, but it would be important to start it just to see how it goes first. Like, I would not discredit the idea. I think it's a great idea for any community to try to preserve their aesthetic culture. And I would love it if there is a school where there are, you know, there's classes for dari making, there's classes for fulkari kadai, there's classes for miniature painting, there's classes for making pigments, there's classes for paper preparation for calligraphy, there's classes for Gurmukhi calligraphy of different fonts and styles. You know, this would be like, that would be my beautiful ideal world where that is happening. But I do know that there's different pockets of this world where that is happening, you know, and I think that experience and expertise needs to be taken and put together into one effort. Although I don't believe in the formal education as much because I don't engage in it, and I you know, I get education. I also think traditional art forms are best taught through demonstration, which is why they were learned through demonstration from your grandparents and your mothers. And women had a huge role to play in this. So there is some sort of a demonstrative element to this that can still be implemented, even if it is not formalized in a school. So even if it's classes that are started, whether it's in a gurdwara or not, I don't know, that's depends on who wants to set, you know, where the kids are going, where the kids are accessible and the parents are accessible. But I just think that's a very good experiment to run. In terms of this, I think that's also really good for starting out the knowledge in the younger kids, especially of, you know, what I would love for them to know more than Bhangra and Dol, basically.
And I think I think this gets to what I would like to highlight from what I've heard from both of you in this conversation and just in general, right? It is about that exposing our youth and our parents and our grandparents, right? It's about exposure for everyone. So like how in our communities, whether it's at Gurdwara, whether it's at cultural programs, whether it's thinking about exhibitions and what you're bringing, maybe it's even a day, a weekend that we're just focused on this, but like, how do you build that exposure? When there are art exhibitions that are close to, even if it's not Sikh art specific, but can like bring that exposure and can get kids, again, parents, grandparents, everyone questioning, okay, what is the comparison that we have, or what is the comparable that we have in our own community? And I'm going to highlight this, right? Hazur art, not this year because of the pandemic, but in the last 2-3 years has created this trade show of Sikh artists, highlighting their work, highlighting individuals, highlighting the different things. And like, you know, as it grows, I'm sure we'll be able to include more of these different art forms and different traditions as well. But when that show comes to town, we need to all show up as well, right? When we have an art exhibition, like you were saying that there were only 500 people at the Triton thing at the opening night. And I'm like, our community could have so much more at opening nights, right? But it is a decision that we as individuals, we as families make about where we're investing our time and where we're investing our resources. And there are a bunch of questions. So Rupy and Sunmit, I hope that I can actually just send you some of them, and maybe you can just respond personally, because we're going to have to wrap up in about 5 minutes.
We'll keep the answer short.
Do a rapid answer session.
Rapid fire.
Okay, we'll do 2 minutes of rapid fire and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, is it possible to get diasporic Gurdwara committees to invest in fresco art to adorn the white walls of our local Gurdwaras? The destruction of this history in the name of Garseva in India and even Pakistan is infuriating and hopeless.
Yes, if they can pay the artists to do it.
Absolutely.
Pay them fairly.
I think to answer, have the conversations with your Gurdwara committees and make a decision that that's something that you want to do, and then pay the artists.
Yep.
And that's another important point that I think is really critical is when you see someone that is really good at what they do, don't ask the question, how will they feed themselves? Find a way as a community to feed them, right? And like, that's what we have to start thinking about.
It's both ways. The artist also has to think about it. I mean, it's both ways. I always say it's both ways.
That's good. For me, it's like, how do we put more of the responsibility on the community to like,
I'm just like the artist
to support, right? And encourage. Yeah. All right. And then if I want to start collecting Sikh art artifacts or even Sikh arms, where do I start? Who do I talk to? Where do I go?
Nice. Well, short answer, rapid fire. You can talk to me. You can slide into my DMs. I have no problem with that. If you have my number, you can text me. Just introduce yourself. I get a lot of DMs where they're like, how much? And then it's kind of like no context as to what are you talking about? Who are you? So introduce yourself. Tell me what you're about, what you want to do. Why do you want to collect? What do you want to collect? And I would be happy, more than happy to help. There's no one way to do this. And I personally can just say I'm here for that.
Excellent. If someone's interested in purchasing Sikh art, where do we look for it? Should we create a central place to study and sell art?
I think Hazur Art was trying to that. Sorry, Rupy, I know I cut you off there.
No central place.
There is no central place because I know one of the questions we got at Hazur Art was from artists from around the world saying, can I just mail you my art? Can you sell it at the show and then mail me the money? And we said no to that because the whole point was for people to meet artists, to have a connection and go beyond just the show, where they have a lifelong relationship with this artist. And it's not a transactional thing where they continue to get commissions made and they invest in the artist and the journey. So it's very important to meet these artists, talk to them. So they could.
Yeah, and if you're not there, you can just email an artist. An artist usually has done this, they do this every day. So they can respond to your email very appropriately and just ask you the right questions. But it's a very intimidating process to ask for price for a work and also to ask for commission. Yeah. But honestly, it's just send a note and the artist will reply.
Yeah, just like last week, I had somebody from Texas ask me that they wanted a piece of modern art. And I was like, I have just the right person that can do that for you, a Sikh artist that can do this for you. And my job was just to connect the two. I can't speak for the artist, I can't price for the artist, and I can't sell for the artist, but the connection is where I come into play.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, and then last question that goes into a question that Gulab Banji had asked is, what are the future plans for both of you? What can we expect next?
Sunmit, do you want to go first?
Sure. For me, I think I am just exploring how to do this full time without having to have a quote unquote day job, which I'm very passionate about. I started my printing business 15 years ago, but I think I'm more passionate about collecting, curating, and storytelling now than ever before. All of this art, whether it's antique or contemporary, is about telling a story. Mm-hmm. You know, that African proverb about the tale is always glorified by the hunter or something like that. I forget what the quote was, but the point is, I want our people to tell our story, be it through antiques or through contemporary art. And I want to be able to do this full time, and I want to start, I want to grow Hazur Art for the contemporary art process. And I want to grow an archive and create an archive that surpasses my lifetime, where Sikhs of the future in the US can actually use it, contribute it, and use it for research. And I need to find a way to assemble a team because one person can't do it. And that's sort of what the future, and I want to continue collecting. I think I can't stop collecting. even if finances are low, we just figure out a way to move some things around and continue collecting, which leads to research and which leads to sharing these stories in the future. So I think that's
And
what's
specifically, is there a Sikh history gallery in the future that somebody could experience in person?
absolutely. I think there's some serious conversation about a museum in California. There's serious conversation about Sikh American Archives, which will have the history of Sikhs in the US that I'm very passionate about and working on. So it's definitely a reality. It's soon coming.
Great. And Rupy, future plans for you?
So for me, I think because of COVID, a lot of the plans are in the air, but I have a few solo shows lined up for next couple of years, in the next year and the year after. So for that, I have to make work. I will be working more on the topic of climate refugees in the coming months. There's a huge project that I've applied for a grant in collaboration with my creative partner, and that project is based on just our complacency. And I don't know how much I can say about it yet, but just our complacency in the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And that will be a project that is rooted in dance, theater, visual art, again, which is something I love, wearing the director hat once in a while. And yeah, at the end of this year, hopefully, I'm working on a Darbar Sahib painting right now, which will be an exhibition in November at the Phoenix Art Museum. And that painting is very important because it's my first actually painting exploring Darbar Sahib.
Wow.
So yeah, it's something I don't lose sleep over at the moment. Mm-hmm. But I think in context of outside of, all the things me as an artist is doing, me as an individual who is artistically involved in this community, I really hope that there's more discussions that I can be a part of. And also, hopefully there'll be a time where I can take on mentors, mentees, and I always do mentorships. I always have mentors, but that I can kind of start to use the knowledge I've gained and train the next, not the next generation even, like people who might be my colleagues and my contemporaries very soon. And that would be amazing, but right now the bandwidth is missing there. Yeah, but these are some of the important things that I'm working on. There's many more things that are scheduled, but again, because of COVID, residencies and all of that have been canceled, but there's a very important residency that I wanted to be a part of that has been rescheduled for next year, where I explored the agricultural roots of our community. And so, yeah, there's a lot of fun, amazing things that I want to work on that I'll get to work on, hopefully, if the times allow. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for all of the time that you spent with us today. I've gotten a couple of chats just saying thank you. This was an excellent Zoom chat. They've learned so much in the last hour, so or an hour and 15 minutes. So thank you both for your time. If you have any resources that you'd like to share, we're happy to email them out to those that have registered. Rupy, especially the one that you said about preservation, so people can take that action item home of preservation and celebration of our own rich history in our houses. So with that, Sunmit, Rupy, thank you for being a part of our summer series. For all of our participants, thank you for joining us both here and on Facebook. And if you want to get connected with Rupy and Sunmit, please do so. We'll send out all of their information right afterwards and include it in the video links. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.